I remember it like it was yesterday, though nearly 50 years have passed since that strange summer of 1934. I was just 12 years old, living with Ma and Pa on our struggling farm in Boone County, Kentucky. Those were the hardest days of the Depression, when dust seemed to gather in every corner of our lives. Our farm had been in Pa's family for 3 generations, but the drought had turned our once fertile land into a wasteland of cracked earth and withered hope. Each morning Pa would walk the fields with his shoulders a little more stooped than the day before. Ma tried to keep our spirits up, but I could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes as our food stores dwindled. "Sarah," Pa said one evening as we sat down to a meagre supper of potato soup, "if we don't get a crop in soon, we might have to sell the farm." His voice cracked on those last words, and I watched as Ma reached across the table to squeeze his hand. That night, I cried myself to sleep. This land was all we had. Where would we go? What would we do? The next day dawned grey and cool, unusual for late May. I was collecting eggs from our few remaining chickens when I noticed a figure standing at the edge of our property, near the road. A tall man in a dark coat, just watching. When he saw me looking, he raised his hand in greeting and began walking toward me. I should have run to get Pa, but something kept me rooted to the spot. As he drew closer, I could see he was older than Pa, with deep lines etched into his face and hair as white as cotton. But his eyes were what caught me, dark and shiny like wet river stones. "Good morning, little miss," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I wonder if your father might be about." Pa must have seen the stranger from the barn, because he came striding over, wiping his hands on his overalls. "Can I help you?" Pa asked, standing slightly in front of me. The stranger smiled. "I believe I can help you, sir. My name is Mr. Blackwood. I've been travelling through these parts and couldn't help but notice your fields." He gestured toward our barren land. "Hard times indeed." Pa's jaw tightened. "We're managing." "Of course," Mr. Blackwood nodded. "But I have something that might interest you." From his coat pocket, he produced a small cloth bag. "Seeds, special ones. They'll grow in any soil, no matter how poor, with very little water." Pa looked skeptical. "What kind of plant?" "A hardy grain, similar to corn, but much more resilient. I've helped many farmers in these parts." Mr. Blackwood held out the bag. "No charge. Consider it a gift from a fellow traveller in hard times." I expected Pa to refuse. He was a proud man, but desperation can make folks do things they wouldn't normally do. After a moment's hesitation, he took the bag. "Much obliged," Pa said stiffly. Mr. Blackwood tipped his hat. "Plant them tonight, after sunset. And remember, they need blood to start. Just a few drops from each family member mixed into the soil. Old farming tradition for luck." He smiled at me. "The young ones especially bring good fortune." Before Pa could respond, Mr. Blackwood turned and walked away, disappearing down the road faster than seemed possible. That evening, Pa opened the bag. The seeds inside were unlike any I'd ever seen, dark purple, almost black, and larger than corn kernels. "We're not really going to plant these, are we?" Ma asked, her voice uneasy. Pa stared at the seeds for a long time. "We've got nothing to lose, Mary." And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we went to the field. Pa had ploughed a small section that afternoon. He made 3 small cuts, one on his palm, one on Ma's, and a tiny one on my finger. We let our blood drip onto the soil, and I watched as Pa mixed it in before planting the strange seeds. "Just an old superstition," Pa reassured us, though he didn't sound convinced himself. 3 days later, green shoots appeared. By the end of the week, the plants were knee-high, something that should have been impossible. They didn't look like corn or wheat or anything I recognized. They had thick purplish stalks and broad leaves that seemed to shine in the moonlight. "Have you ever seen anything grow so fast?" Ma whispered one evening as we stood at the edge of the field. I shook my head, unable to take my eyes off the plants. Something about them made my skin prickle. Sometimes, when I was alone, I could swear I heard them rustling, even when there wasn't any wind. By mid-June, the field was full of these strange plants, now taller than Pa. They bore fruit, if you could call it that, dark, bulbous pods that hung heavy from the stalks. And our other fields, the ones we hadn't planted with Mr. Blackwood's seeds, began to show new growth too. But things around the farm started to change. Our chickens laid eggs with double yolks every time. The milk from our cow turned thick and yellowish, and the wild animals, rabbits, foxes, even birds, seemed to avoid our property altogether. Worst of all were the dreams. Every night I dreamed of the field. In my dreams, the plants would whisper things to me, terrible things about hunger and feeding and growing. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, certain that something was watching me from the darkness outside my window. One night in late July, I woke to strange sounds coming from outside. Slipping from my bed, I crept to the window and peered out toward the field. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. Pa was out there, moving among the plants, but he wasn't alone. Dark shapes moved with him, around him, shapes that seemed to emerge from the plants themselves. And standing at the edge of the field was Mr. Blackwood, his white hair glowing in the moonlight. I must have made a sound because Pa looked up toward my window. Even from that distance, I could see something was wrong with his eyes. They were dark, too dark, like the seeds we'd planted. The next morning, Pa didn't remember going to the field, but after that night, our fortunes mysteriously improved. The strange crop continued to thrive, and somehow, our regular fields recovered too. By harvest time, we had more than enough to get through the winter and even sell some in town. Mr. Blackwood never returned, at least not while I was watching. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I still think I can hear those plants whispering, even though Pa burned the field after harvest. We never planted those seeds again. Pa said we didn't need to. Our land was healthy once more. But I've always wondered what price we really paid for our salvation that desperate summer. Because even now, all these years later, I still have the dreams. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of something in my eyes. Something dark and shiny, like wet river stones.